welcome Jim Steele.
Thank you very much, Bob. How's that sound level? Okay with everybody?
Perfect.
Okay. Well, first of all, it's wonderful to be with all of you at the Philadelphia Ethical Society, and I also extend the greeting also to all of you in North Carolina. I can almost imagine myself standing there at the podium on Rittenhouse Square, looking out at the group that I've seen before, and seeing your faces and seeing the curiosity that so many of you have in the Ethical Society, which is one of the reasons I like visiting with you. I've always felt such a kinship with what you believe in and what you would like to see happen in this country. And I think you believe in the right things, and believing in the right things and wanting to do the right thing is probably maybe more important right now in America than at any time. I don't know about all of you, but frankly, I'm a little worried about America right now. And I assume many of you are too. I mean, how can we not be upset at a lot of things that are going on? I'm a little bit worried about this time leading up to the election itself, and whatever is going to happen after the election. Some people are even worried more than I am and are quite concerned that it has to do with the future of democracy. We've never been in a time like this, a time where basic accepted practices in our democracy, things that we've taken for granted for decades, for eons, are now suddenly being called into question. Our entire political culture is built around advancing, enhancing, and safeguarding our democracy. Our democracy is the beacon to the rest of the world, and it makes all of us proud. Whether you were a Democrat or a Republican, the nation went on decade after many other countries fell victim to one political malady after another, from revolutions to military coups to disputed elections to dictatorships. The idea of a sitting president not committing to a peaceful transfer of power, I think, is unthinkable to any of us mature adults. I often wonder nowadays what teenagers and even more concerning young children are thinking watching this first election. I hope their parents give them a history lesson. Beyond these immediate worries, there's something that deeply concerns me, and I know deeply concerns other people, that goes well beyond this immediate election, and in fact goes back many elections before this. And that's what I really want to talk to you about today. Pardon my voice. I don't have COVID-19. I've actually been doing an awful lot of radio and television interviews regarding the new book. And the voice is like a muscle, and sometimes it gets a little bit worn out. So I just want you to know, even through the airways, I'm not going to expend any molecules here that will infect you in any way. But what I'm concerned about, through our policies, various administrations and Congresses, spurred on in many cases by divisive right-wing rhetoric that says any and all government is evil, who believe that the private market, as opposed to public policy, that's what they think should set the agenda for Americans. Well, those policies, which have pretty much been in place continuously now for decades, have resulted in staggering income inequality in America. It's been in the works for many, many years. Indeed, Donna and I wrote about this back in the 90s, but it's taken COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter movement to lay bare just how wide this chasm is between the haves and the have-nots in America. There's an image from this time that I'm never, ever going to forget. 1 or 2 weeks after the coronavirus struck, there we saw on television or on websites long lines of cars and trucks of people waiting to pick up boxes of food. These weren't people who were rounded up under local overpasses, or the sad, unfortunate folks who come up to us at stoplights begging anything. No, these were working people who had been thrown out of work, and a week or two later didn't have the money for food because they had no safety net whatsoever. That's because they don't make enough money, or they have to spend too much money for their health care or child care or some combination of all of this. So even a week was more than their strained budgets could handle. If you're okay and you can pay your bills, then you may not see this other side. But I'm telling you, it is there, and it's real, and it's growing And this was true even before COVID-19 struck the country. The truth is that this country, the world's most prosperous, most Americans are living on the edge. A couple of years ago, the New York Federal Reserve conducted a remarkable study. And the conclusion of the study was that if almost half of Americans were confronted with a $400 emergency, where they needed $400 in cash, they don't have it. Almost half the country is in that situation. And obviously a few above that aren't much better off. Now, there have always been rich and poor people in America, and of course, always will be rich and poor people. But there was something else America created in the 20th century that I really want to talk to you about. After World War II and the decades afterward, America created on a grand scale a bustling, prosperous, hopeful middle class. Listen to these numbers. In 1959, as our middle class grew, the top 4% of Americans earned as much as the bottom 39%. But by 2018, after decades of showering the rich with tax benefits and undermining certain benefits that the middle class had long had, the top 4% earned as much as the bottom 50%, 57%. And of course, that number is bound to be worse now since COVID, because that has not affected folks at the top much at all, but it's affected almost everybody else in this country. So that was before the virus began raging through the incomes of middle class and poor people alike. All those people who didn't have robust stock portfolios, in other words, most Americans, they're in that situation. Also in an early era, corporations paid almost 40% of the total amount of income taxes paid. In 2020, even before COVID, that number was going to be less than 10%. When Don and I wrote the first edition of America What Went Wrong back in the 90s, we warned about growing income inequality unless we changed our policy. Soon thereafter, we used a term that would catch fire many years later. We wrote about the top 1% and its growing share of national wealth and the threat that that posed to democracy. The Wall Street Journal took its lead editorial one day to blast us, called us the sister soldiers of economic populism. You like that? I need to get a little lapel pin about that, sister soldier. But anyway, the Wall Street Journal, by the way, I want to stress, a lot of its news columns I have the highest regard for. I have friends who work there. Their editorial page, I think, is the Journal's answer to the funny papers, because half the time it's almost comical if it wasn't writing about serious issues. Now, of course, income inequality, which was then controversial, is widely recognized and the subject of endless debates on how to deal with it. The first way to deal with it is the tax code. The code has been the single greatest driver of income inequality in the last 40 years. You realize that in 1980, the top rate on some income was 70%. Today, the top rate is 37%. But that doesn't even tell the full story. Let's look into those numbers and see what's behind them, how well those numbers are treating certain people in our country. For the class of Americans earning 1 million or more, the Trump tax bill handed them a $64,000 a year tax cut for 10 years. If you were in the heart of the middle class, let's say making $50,000 to $75,000, well, what did you get? You got $800 a year. People are asking me all the time, why do average Americans put up with this? I think one of the reasons is they feel grateful for the pittance they are receiving and simply do not realize often how they've been snookered by those above them. They may suspect it, but they often don't know the actual numbers. That's been my work for decades, to show those details in black and white. And that's what the new book does. It updates the larceny. The numbers I just rattled off, which have surprised a lot of people as I've done interviews around the country on the new book. People have been stunned by those. But you know what? They're not even a secret. They're found in a publicly available document, a report of Congress's Joint Committee on Taxation, a committee that dates back 100 years. They analyzed the Trump tax bill. In addition to those numbers I told you, there's another number that you can extrapolate from those numbers. And in some ways, it may be the most revealing one of all. When you take the 10-year life of the Trump tax bill and you see that income flowing to those making $1 million or more a year, how much total money will go to them over that decade? More than $500 billion. $500 billion is going to flow into the pockets of people who don't need any more money. Is that the kind of policy we really want to make in this country that helps us all, that spreads prosperity to everyone? Taxes are one of the reasons for income inequality and the middle class decline, and why more people are staying trapped at the bottom. Others, of course, are healthcare, deregulation, and pensions. The Affordable Care Act or Obamacare helped fill a crucial need, but there were still 20 million people before COVID-19, Americans who didn't have insurance. And of course, since then, millions and millions of more have lost their employer-paid health insurance. And this has underscored the need for some form of universal coverage to ensure people in times like this who've lost their job through no fault of their own, and who might lose their homes if they have to go into a hospital and can't pay those bills down the road. We deal with all of these in the new book, but one particular statistic I think should be noted because it foretells what's going to happen to millions of working Americans unless we as a nation take some action. Anyone care to guess what percentage of working Americans in the private sector are covered by a pension plan these days? I'm talking about people actually working, not people who are retired and drawing a pension. Well, the number is 2%. Not so long ago, that number was 30% and growing. Now it is 2% and falling. One of the great successful sell jobs that corporate lobbyists scored in Washington was to convince lawmakers to pass laws that would make it easier to kill pensions and substitute 401k plans in their stead. There's nothing wrong with 401ks, but they're a very poor substitute for pensions. And it'll mean that millions of Americans will face, if not an impoverished retirement, certainly a constrained one. All these actions have undermined the middle class. Median family income has not kept pace. At the time we wrote the first American What Went Wrong back in the 90s, median family income was $34,000. If just that had kept pace in the ensuing 25 plus years, median family income today would be somewhere around $69,000, $70,000. Instead, it's closer to $62,000, 10% less. No wonder the middle class continues to shrink. Our data shows that 39% of taxpayers were in the middle class in 1980. Today, it's less than 31%. What I want to talk to you about now and for the rest of this program, and hope to hear your questions afterward, and we'll have a discussion. It doesn't have to be this way. That's my biggest message to you today. This isn't happening to the middle class and working people and poor people because of some natural phenomena in the economy that we can't control, that we're hopeless to direct. There isn't some law of nature at work here that consigns more than half our population to just getting by. This is because of specific policies in taxes, healthcare, retirement, deregulation, specific actions taken by Congresses and presidents over the last 40 years that have created this dire picture. We have the power to change this. We can change policies. We just need the will and the commitment. As we spell out in the book, there have been numerous times in American history when the well-being of most Americans was at risk, and when we as a nation responded. The Pure Food and Drug Act, enacted during Teddy Roosevelt's administration, is a perfect example, one we still live under, and which has a tremendous impact on our lives today. It had to do with poisoned food, medications that were killing people. Congress finally responded over powerful lobbies and enacted legislation. The income tax in the 19-teens was a similar thing. At that time, working people were paying the bulk of money to run the government. The income tax essentially came into being to tax the very wealthy. Social Security in the 30s, Medicare in the 60s, extremely important toward providing a stable foundation for part of our society. Where do you think this country would have been in the Great Recession of 2008 if we hadn't had Social Security and Medicare? uh, Medicare. And Obamacare, of course, is angrily opposed by the grandparents of those of folks who opposed Medicare and Social Security before. Once those things get into place, have you ever noticed how a lot of folks who were so animated against things suddenly think they're okay? And that's why one of these days we'll probably have universal health coverage. No one will make any bones about it. And people will forget this unbelievable struggle for decades, because then everyone will embrace it. What we need now is a broad-based program in taxes, infrastructure, investment, job creation, and really especially healthcare. And it requires us as a nation to think differently than we've been thinking about national policies over the last few years. Remember Ronald Reagan's memorable contribution to a civic discourse? He said, the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. That produced all kinds of guffaws and laughs and various kinds of things back in the 80s. And it set the tone for what would happen over the next 40 years, when government would be vilified right and left and so forth. But as we've seen in the examples I just quoted above, government can be a very positive force. And this is what we need to do now in a whole range of areas, from increasing taxes to shoring up our retirement system, increasing the minimum wage, and particularly right now with healthcare. COVID-19 has exposed the tremendous Achilles heel to our healthcare system. It has nothing to do with the quality of the practitioners, the quality of some of our equipment. It has to do with the system itself. Does it take care of the population as a whole? And the answer is no. And that's why we have this terrible crisis out there right now. The suggestion that to have a proactive government isn't somehow bringing forth these cries of socialism, even communism, this is the most ridiculous stuff I've ever heard. Were Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower communists? I mean, 2 presidents from different parties who presided over major national programs that benefited the great mass of Americans. The private market alone hasn't been able to deal with the crisis we're in right now, even before COVID. It needs something broader than that, a partnership between the two. And that's among the reasons that in those days, when you didn't have this huge gap between those at the top and everyone else, it was because you had, in effect, a public and private partnership. So in summary, we're at a crossroads. This election is hugely important. Even assuming a progressive result, there are great challenges ahead, but we need to get started on this job. For too long, we've taken a hands-off position and let the market rule. And it's created the most unequal society we've had in America in the last 100 years. America is better than that. We can do better than that. And as I've just mentioned, there are plenty of examples of where we have done better than that. Securing economic and social justice, though, has always been a tough sell in America. We adopted Social Security in the 1930s, decades after virtually every other major European had done so. And one of the interesting asides to it that I've never forgotten, when FDR introduced the first bill that eventually led to Social Security, he actually kind of tried to disguise the fact that it was going to be a retirement plan. Even though he had a huge majority in Congress, he had been elected overwhelmingly in the election. But he had to do that because he knows that this anti-government streak in America is so powerful. You have to be careful of you don't want to poke the bear too strongly or it gets all upset. So what did he call the bill that he first introduced it? Unemployment compensation and old age security. I just kind of slipped that sucker in there a little bit. But that gives you an idea of how hard it is to do these things. America possesses many wonderful citizens who want to do the right thing. But when that happens, we invariably come face to face with this bedrock of opposition from conservatives and folks who believe the government shouldn't put its hand in any aspect of our daily lives. And in doing so in any form, it's somehow or another evil. The policy, of course, that has now relegated millions and millions of Americans to the margin. The time has come to restore the balance, to enact measures that help everyone, not to just put an extra $64,000 into the pockets of people who don't need the money. We must not kid ourselves about this, how difficult this is going to be. Those who like the status quo also have a lot of money and access to the powers that be. But even so, if enough people speak up and elect the right people and make their positions known, change can come. I mean, it's happened before. I want to leave you with the words of one of the great social and economic justice fighters in American history, Frederick Douglass, the fugitive slave whose abolitionist rhetoric helped end slavery. Douglass was a stirring speaker, an eloquent writer who could frame great issues in just a few words. And this sentence of his from more than a century ago applies as much to our own time as it did to his. Douglass wrote, "Without a struggle, there can be no progress." Well, we're in a struggle now, and hopefully, maybe I can come back here in a few years and visit with you again and report that we've made progress. I sure hope so. For America needs it, our people need it, our democracy needs it, and if we do that, we can restore the American dream for everyone. Thank you so very much.